Okay. So thank you everyone for logging on today. We put together a few slides just to have some background and get everyone on the same page. If you just entered the call a little bit ago, I just had chatted over the ICC resource that I'd sent along a few days ago for everyone to do a little bit of background and refresher on this. The ICC just released this on September 30th of this year, so pretty recent. And so a lot of what we're discussing today will be based upon this resource attached in the chat. And so if you have it up, please do a refresher, get some thoughts, opinions. After I present these few background slides based upon some of the takeaways from last time, as well as some new upcoming topics we want to discuss, we will have this as a full open discussion. So please feel free to unmute yourself, chat questions, or just unmute yourself or raise your hand and enter. We do want to have this as interactive as possible. So yeah, and so I know some people already started doing this, but also it would help us out a lot just to get a better viewpoint of who is all attending and who is participating. So if you're able to type your name and organization within the chat, that would help us out a lot with managing our kind of stakeholder group in regards to this topic. For those who did not attend our first working group, that was on July 30th of this year, we do have that recording up on our DFW Clean Cities website on our events page. As follow-up to this meeting, we will send that first recording as well as send the new recording for this, as well as some takeaways from both the first call as well as the second call. As a reminder, we are setting up this working group to help develop regional resources to provide consistency in EV capable and EV ready construction across North Texas, as well as other regions that are on this call as well in Texas. And so in July, our first kind of task was checked off. We did assemble our working group and had our first meeting. It was a really good conversation. A lot of different topics are brought up, a lot of different good takeaways and concerns that we as COG took as kind of our running to do a little bit more digging and research on if those concerns are valid and what different direction we could go in order to kind of maintain momentum forward and trying to get some guidance. So the second call we put together just to help identify some regional guidance and references and resources using some of the research we found, as well as some of the resources since we've last met that have been published and released. Eventually, our end goal for this working group is to present and release working group findings, have a consistent, kind of concise vision of what and how Texas could implement these codes themselves. Also, as a reminder, this was brought up last time, but for those of you that need to have a refresher, it's a little bit confusing when people start talking about this, but when you talk about EV ready codes and EV ready buildings, there's actually 3 different categories that live within that kind of general description. So EV capable means that basically the electricity's there, it's all wired ready. However, there is no ability to plug it in. There's no ability to have a actual station installed right there. You'll still have to have an electrician come in and put in the plugs, everything like that. However, that power and wiring is all there. EV ready is the middle. Basically, it takes EV capable and then installs an outlet. So as soon as you buy the infrastructure, it's all ready to go, much easier installation process. And then finally, the EV installed spaces, that is EV capable with a full usable EV charging station available on site. And so when most of the time when they're talking about EV installed, they are talking about level 2 stations. If it is talking about a DC fast charging station, that will be determined and specified within their description. The reason why we want to talk about this and why we're trying to get in the forefront of all of this is because it's a lot less expensive to install EV capable infrastructure during new construction than standalone retrofits. There are stats that show 0.1 to 0.5% is the total cost added to new construction projects to add EV readiness to multifamily residential. For commercial construction, it is comparable in those prices, but this is basically showcasing that adding EV capability and EV readiness to new construction is pretty negligible on total project costs, especially compared to what you would have to do to retrofit that building to accommodate that for future growth. This is a little grainy to see, but you do have it linked down there with what the source is. It's from the Pacific Northwest National Labs. They released an electric vehicle charging for residential and commercial energy codes. Has a lot of great resources through that. But with this, it's just a quick visualization of the different costs that are adding into the different construction for EV ready parking spaces. So the left is scenario A. This is a 10 parking space building and they are accommodating for 2 electric parking spaces. You could see the different types of costs that add up. Includes construction management, permitting and inspection, raceway, balance or circuit. In both scenario A and scenario B, you see that most of those costs, because you're just adding it in and clumping it into an existing project that's already happening, a lot of those costs are minimized. And so that's why we think you need to push it now before necessarily it's needed at that specific site, because you do save so much more money in the long run. And so you do have an economy of scale with this, as what's showcased in the right scenario B. The more spaces you're adding into the building, the lesser cost it is to add it. And so the larger the building, the larger the parking lot, the kind of more bang for your buck you're getting by adding it into that original construction cost at the beginning. From last time, just some key takeaways and concerns that were brought up during our last working group. I'm just going to kind of go through this, and feel free, we could stop through this and have some conversation with additional comments that people have about these. We're not completely writing them off. This is just some follow-ups in regards to some of the topics that were brought up last time. So if I just keep on talking, you can definitely feel free to raise your hand and I'll stop, or you can chat. We have a couple other COG staff on here too that are able to monitor the chat for us. And so definitely don't feel afraid to make me pause here. So first one, building codes are for safety standards, and EV readiness is beyond safety. It's adding an amenity. It doesn't belong within a building code. We've done a lot of research on this, and we understand that concern with that, because an EV charging station is an addition to a building. It's not necessarily needed for the building to survive, for the building to be safe. However, in order to kind of mitigate that concern, there are other approaches available to pursue EV readiness that's not just creating EV readiness within the building codes themselves. There are many examples that people have used land use, parking, or zoning ordinances to determine the EV readiness minimums, and then they also accompany that minimum kind of ordinance with their technical specifications within the codes. So the safety of that minimization, of that parking minimization, would be accommodated within the building codes, which would be that safety standard. However, it's not determining, the building codes aren't pushing for that necessity of the EV readiness themselves. And so some cities just do approach it for taking it into the building codes themselves, but there are other approaches in which we'll get more details in a couple of slides. The second concern and kind of topic that was mainly the main takeaway from that last call, commercial buildings would have many less barriers in EV readiness. We were very set from that last call to move forward with this working group in focusing purely on commercial elements. However, once we've done a lot deeper of a dive into what precedent has kind of been set across the country, mainly people have been adopting multifamily codes at more aggressive rates, with lesser aggressive accompanying commercial codes, if they have any commercial codes. And so when talking about EV readiness from a national perspective, it is something that is pretty standardized to be more focused on the multifamily elements. Both a commercial and multifamily approach is normally done as a package deal. People aren't doing it as one or the other. It's a combination. And so the resource from the ICC gives a kind of a nice laid out table of different examples of what different municipalities and local governments have adopted in regards to levels of what they have. But essentially with this, because multifamily is lacking a lot of available infrastructure for their residents right now, many people that live in apartments or multifamily properties don't have access to any sort of charging, it's taking EV readiness as filling that gap for people who don't have charging. The EPA does state that over 80% of people do their charging at home. And so EV readiness would be basically allowing for people who don't have charging to fill that gap and have charging. And then the commercial codes would basically be supplementing people's every day. So it would be, you're going on a trip, you're going to a small shopping center, fill up, but it's not necessarily your everyday type of charge that we would need. Next one, single family residence codes are not a good place to start. There is a perception of pricing people out of the market with single families. This is pretty standard across the country as well. Most cities aren't taking on a single family focus. Like I said, they are doing a main focus on multifamily and construction and commercial. And so single family can be optional. It's not something that you need to do, but also taking into account that it's essentially just creating one EV ready space within a single family garage for just new construction. So it'd essentially just be making sure the wiring is attached and you have all the electrical capacity ready for that garage. And that could be someone putting in an extra refrigerator or an extra clothes dryer in there if they really wanted. It's just getting that electrical capacity to that garage space. So in the future, if more people are wanting and needing that faster charge within their home, that they can do that. Another reason why single family is not necessarily needed to be pursued forward, electric vehicles can charge on a standard 110 volt if you have the plug. It's very slow, but if you have accessibility to a single charge at a single family residence, you're not going to be without electricity to be able to charge your vehicle. It'll just be at a much slower rate. So it's not necessarily people don't have it right now. It's just that they wouldn't be ready for that faster charge. The next one, people had some concerns about limited electrical capacity and the pressure that adding all this EV readiness and all this extra power and possible power need onto the grid. And so Oncor does have interest in EV ready codes. They're on the call today. They don't necessarily believe that it's going to be a major concern. It's not going to tip over the grid and having all this capacity ready and all this EV readiness ready. And so, Tom, if you want to give a brief kind of background of why Oncor quickly has that.
Okay. I would say that especially if we know ahead of time that there are potential for EVs, we are able to build the grid in such a way to ensure that this happens. Now, where we need to know are in commercial situations where there might be fleets, and we need to know that in a lot of time so we can get out there and make sure that we have the amount of code. We can get what is needed there. We can get the capacity there that's needed, but it might take a little while. If you're in a residence, it's not going to be a whole lot different than when central air conditioning came along. There was we typically build for a peak load, for a very high load. And if we can shift away from those times, that might be the one thing that we would ask people is don't come in pulling to your garage at 5 o'clock in the afternoon and immediately plug in 220 to run for several hours, because that would be adding to a peak situation. But if we can get some kind of managed charging, and we can know ahead of time if it's a commercial type fleet, then I don't think we should be able, Oncor should be able to get the grid, get the adequate power to you in a timely basis.
Mm-hmm. So thanks, Tom. And so it basically is, it's allowing for everyone to be able to plan ahead. Like Tom mentioned, that if it's basically you're building out a huge construction site with tons of multifamily and commercial and have this EV readiness, if they have time in advance to be able to manage and basically forecast how much extra load, that's even better than having later if they hey, basically in 5 years, we need to be able to have 30 spaces here. And so it allows for people to forecast, allows people to be ready, and allows the grid to basically figure out how to manage and figuring out those timing issues. Finally, the political will and support was mentioned. Having the lack of political will and support from many different industries coming together. The safety thing, people were saying they have concerns about firemen not and fire marshals not having understanding, and that's going to cause some issues. Not having basically support from the builders, the residents, the commercial developers, everyone, because there isn't consistency and understanding of the safety and background of it. Luckily for us, the International Codes Council just released their official model language for EV readiness amendments to be added in. So basically you can just take that and put it in. It has been vetted by the DOE. Everyone that basically is supporting the codes in general has vetted this for safety, for verbiage, for everything. So it really does give that support and backing that a lot of people were questioning on if we took the approach of just writing it out ourselves. So from the technical safety perspective of all of that, of what would be added to the codes, that's already set and ready to go if we choose to go in that direction. In regards to EV readiness process options, like I mentioned in the previous slide, you don't have to adopt EV readiness within the International Energy Conservation Codes as has been proposed through the ICC. And so basically in Texas, a municipality has authority to make ordinances within its boundaries for land use and development code, zoning and ordinance code, green building codes, the electrical code, and the International Codes Council, and they've more specified that the amendments to go into the International Energy Conservation Code. And the ones that are orange are the ones that we have seen people from across the country adopting these EV readiness ordinances into, with different types of verbiage and all that. But you can pick and choose where and how is easiest for your specific municipality and jurisdiction to be able to adopt this. Other options and other non-ordinance options for those that don't think that this is going to go through, or the process is just a little too convoluted or takes too long of a time. There are other non-ordinance options that can help further this initiative. And so for cities, from a permitting and implementing incentives perspective, you can implement certain EV readiness inclusions into your processes, including discounting permitting or expediting permitting. And that would essentially force people, not force people, that's the whole point. They have a choice, but it gives an incentive for them to opt into this EV readiness. And so you say, if you do this in your construction, we will give you X, Y, Z. To basically move forward for them. And so it's a way to get around and push developers to be able to accommodate for this without forcing them to, if your jurisdictional boundary does not seem to want to take that direction at this point. Another strategy is adopting long-range EV or EVSE goals to support EV readiness as an action strategy to help achieve that goal. This is something many governments are doing today. They are looking forward 20, 30 years and saying, this date, we want to have X amount of EVs or X amount of EVSE. So once you have that long range goal, next step is to figure out the strategies that you can do in the meantime in order to help reach that goal. EV readiness is one of those ways to help reach that goal. And so adopting and getting that would be basically helping kind of pave that direction and giving that support behind your administration in order to move forward and adopting these things. Now on to the International Codes Council, the model language released. This is what is linked in the chat, but it covers both commercial and residential EV infrastructure as part of an amendment that you can add in as part of the International Energy Conservation Codes. It covers EV capable and EV ready and EV installed minimum parking space standards language based upon the amount of total available parking spaces. However, the model language does not include recommended numbers. They leave all the language there, and then the exact numbers for implementation, they leave blank because they think that it is up to each individual jurisdiction. Within the resource itself, they give a big table of what other people have done across the country and what they have implemented. So you can use that as a basis for an example. They have a backing for this because EV codes are a supporting element in the national goal of achieving net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. And so that's really important because transportation emissions in the US, according to the EPA, are approximately 29%. And so electrifying the transportation sector is very important in helping us reach that goal. And buildings are the infrastructure that are helping support the fueling of those new lower emission vehicle cars. And so additionally, in August of 2021 of this year, the U.S. administration released an executive order encouraging 1/2 of all new vehicles sold in 2030 to be zero emission vehicles. So we see that the administration, the auto industry in general, they are following the trends in order to transition over into more electrified vehicle fleet across the country and across the world in general. And so we're trying to take this and get ready for that transition. So our buildings, especially as our region is growing so quickly and has so much construction going on, in order to incorporate this, so we save money and our buildings are ready in order to accommodate for the vehicles. This is the example table that they have within that model language. It is based upon percent number of EV installed, percent number of EV ready, and percent number of EV capable spaces. And then it's also broken down by how many spaces. So basically, many of the other cities that have utilized this sort of methodology, the smaller amount of spaces you have, the less aggressive the minimum standard is. And then the more spaces you have, the more aggressive it is. And so normally it's like, okay, if 1 to 25 spaces, you only have to install 1 EV installed space. But if you have 26% or more, 26 spaces or more, it goes to a generalized percentage that's a little bit more aggressive. And so there are different ways. If you think that smaller buildings are going to be harder, it's going to be a harder hit on them. There are ways to manipulate that and how much and what you want to have installed within your specified jurisdiction. And now to go to some examples, the IECC is not the only model language that has been released. The International Green Construction Code also released a model code language in order to incorporate EV charging facilities. And essentially with this, where 20 more on-site vehicle parking spaces are provided, the International Building Code of all those occupancy groups, not less than 4% of the total number of parking spaces or not less than 8% of designated employee-only parking spaces should be EV ready. And then where 10 or more on-site vehicle parking spaces are provided for those residential coded buildings, not less than 20% of total number of spaces should be EV ready. And so EV ready, like they said, it's that middle kind of category. It's the EV capable with the plug. And so it does have this requirement as an additional option outside of the ICC resources. And they did list an exception where parking spaces designated for other than passenger vehicles are permitted to be excluded from total number of on-site parking spaces. And so this is just one example of other model code that's being added. And now examples of kind of how other cities and other states have gone about these processes and what they've done, and kind of some facts and interesting stuff to be able to use this as a jumping point for our conversations ourselves. And so I know many of you are probably staring at the screen and saying, why the heck does she have California on there? It's because they are a leader in this. And from a state perspective, they have the longest standing record of basically piloting this type of initiative. And so don't be fearful that it says California, but they have a long range goal within the state itself to have 5 million electric vehicles on the road by 2030, including 250,000 EV charging stations by 2050, which includes 10,000 DC fast chargers and 200 hydrogen fueling sites. They have adopted EV Readiness into their 2020 California Green Building Code, in which all local jurisdictions have to adopt a minimum of the code. Within their code, they have multifamily new construction as 10% EV capable. And then they also adopted an approach of 2-tiered stretch codes. which basically allows cities, if they don't like the minimum code, it allows them to adopt certain thresholds of increased aggressiveness that they think is still feasible. And so they enabled that and put that in there where all the jurisdictions can approach that stretch code. And then they have in their single family, they do have that where basically they have to have one space be EV capable to support level 2 charger. And then commercial buildings, you can see that it is a lesser percentage, as you see in most of the examples here, but it requires 6% of EV capable spaces, and then they have the reach codes of approximately 8 to 10%. California is under development for an increasing this code level in their 2022 Cal Green codes. And so that is something that is also taken into account for us, is that it doesn't have to be an all-in singular approval right now. It can be something we do a little bit lighter now, and then a few years down the road, we start to get more aggressive when people are a little bit more comfortable with the concept. 20 jurisdictions across California have adopted their REACH codes, and then some are concordantly implementing parking ordinances in order to supplement it. And then as well as many others are exploring expanding to existing buildings, like the targeting alterations and additions to construction, as well as this new construction. Denver, the city of Denver is another example. They also adopted a long-range goal of 30% EVs by 2030. They adopted the EV readiness by amending the 2018 IECC. They include single family with 1 EV ready space, multifamily with 10 plus spaces. So if it's beneath 10 spaces, that does not have to accommodate for EV readiness, but they have 5% EV installed, 15% EV ready, and 75% EV capable. It's much more aggressive than California with this. And then their commercial, significantly less aggressive than their multifamily, but it's 5% EV installed, 10% EV ready, and then 10% EV capable. And so you do see that this is pretty common within all the examples that we're showing, as well as all the examples that are listed within that ICC resource, is that we are seeing the commercial level to be a little less aggressive than the multifamily. Denver itself does have the building alterations accommodated and put into their codes. And so they have, if work exceeds 50% of the building area or more than 10 parking spaces are modified, they must comply with the new construction, multifamily, or commercial code requirements for this. Additionally, they added in a DC fast charging component, which is something to take into consideration. So out of the required spaces, they can substitute up to 5 of the required level 2 spaces with 1 of the DC fast charging spaces and still meet the requirement. This is a way to basically incentivize certain developers to put in those fast charging infrastructure where needed and strategically located without having to kind of burden that cost of still requiring X amount of extra level 2 chargers, because a DC fast charger is significantly more expensive. And then the final 2 examples, Winter Park, Florida. They got EV readiness ordinances that amended their building code as well as their land development code. And so this is for the people that basically thought that the codes were for safety and they didn't want to put the parking minimums and all that within the code. This is what Winter Park did in order to mitigate that. They have the land development code amended their off-street parking and loading regulations to include electric vehicle infrastructure and parking space requirements to non-residential buildings to require 10% level 2 EV ready, as well as 1 level 2 EV installed space per every 20 parking spaces. And then they went in and added the EVSE technical amendments into their building codes in order to support that consistency and all of that. And so the actual minimums and everything is within their land use code rather than their building code. And then finally, an example from Vancouver. They, while international, still very relevant because of their approach, which is something that is very interesting that we hadn't seen before. I haven't seen any other people do this before. So we wanted to highlight this to bring up in discussion. But essentially, they did that 100% EV ready for multifamily. and then their commercial is 10% EV ready. And while 100% EV ready sounds very, very aggressive, they don't have a requirement to install full electrical capacity to charge all the spaces at full power at once. And so basically they are saying you have to have every space to be able to charge. But if every space is filled and charging, you don't have to charge it at full capacity. You could do slower chargers so to not get hit with like that huge demand charge. And so through that, they do encourage the use of EV energy management systems, which they have an acronym there, to achieve a high level of EV readiness without the need for larger building electrical capacity upgrades and all that. So basically, you're taking all your spaces, figuring out how and where what spaces need to have full power and how to manage that, which is kind of going about what Tom was saying, managing the time and how fast things are charging at once. You don't want to plug in your car and have everyone plug in their car at once across the entire metroplex, and then we're getting hit on afternoon peak demand charges and all that, and this is just adding into it. Having this managed EV charging systems could really help try to mitigate some of those demand concerns and grid concerns. And so we definitely want to do a little bit more research into that, but a very unique perspective on how they move forward with that. And so now we would like to open it up to discussion. That was a lot of information, but who had a chance to go through the sample language yet? Did anyone have any concerns or?
Looks good to me.
Who is that speaking?
Jason with Spear.
Oh, cool. Yeah. So, what was your perspective of it, Jason, when you walked through it from your you're a little bit more ready to handle this topic than most people. So,
well, I mean, it's just, you know how it is. It's just so city specific. I mean, you're going to have, I mean, Austin probably will love the, well, actually, Austin's already moving and doing some of that stuff, of course. But I think some cities will look at that language and think, we're not, you know, we're going to let the market decide this. We're not going to do any of this. But then it's going to be a great blueprint for others. I think it's a great kind of starting point, and I don't have any profound thoughts on it or anything, but I think it's so far so good, I guess is what I'd say.
Did anyone else have any thoughts on basically us taking that model language and moving forward with it, or is it something that we think we still would rather create more of an individualized approach? Because at this point, the release of that model language helped us out a lot in our possible direction. And so our job, I think, as a group would be coming up with those regional scale of appropriate EV readiness, EV capable, and EV installed language for different types of jurisdictions to be able to move forward with.
Seems very grandiose, and Vancouver was certainly shocking on multifamily.
Yes. What are people's thoughts on that kind of EV management plan approach? Because that was something that we thought was very interesting, but also requires a lot more technical expertise from the city that's managing it themselves to be able to develop that secondary kind of plan. So do you guys think that that would be something that is a little too complicated, or how do people feel about kind of that EV management plan of timing?
Encore, really particularly interested in hearing what y'all think about that. I thought it was very interesting, but it to me also seems a little risky, maybe, you know. In DFW Airport, I guess y'all would be one of the places where there could be a very high population of EVs all at one time. You know, do you build out so that you have the capability of charging 300 electric vehicles all at once, but they're all going to get a trickle charge, as opposed to those vehicles being able to plug in and and know that they're going to be ready to go in 30 minutes. So that seemed like there's definitely a value proposition there, but just curious in practicality in Texas, the way we typically do things, what y'all think of the implementation feasibility there.
Well, Lori, at Encore, as I said earlier, as long as we have enough time, I think that we'll be able to accommodate whatever is needed. Now, the cost is going to be getting the equipment installed, because probably where you're going to be putting it, you're going to be going through a lot of existing stuff, concrete, maybe location of other underground facilities that are there. So I think because the way it is now, the cost is going to be driven up unless you go to a EV specific parking situation or something like that, and actually build something new. But I think if we are given enough time, and it's going to require to build additional facilities without a doubt, at least in a situation like that. But if we're given enough time, we should be able to get done what needs to be done. We don't need someone to come to us and say we need 100 parking spaces in 6 months. That's going to be a challenge. But if they say we would like it here, here, and here, and you know, a reasonable time frame, we'll discuss with them. We'll do whatever we need to do. We'll work backwards, but it's beyond the scope of possibility for some things that people might want. Which, I'll be honest, our main concern right now is fleets. Because if someone comes in and says they want it, they're going to bring in 18 wheelers, 100 of them, and we need power in 3 months, unless we just happen to have something wide open out there, that is going to be a true challenge. So given enough time, given enough information, I think we can get it done.
And those comments really just kind of highlight the need to start thinking about this more so on the front end than we are. I mean, I know you know, the skeptics will say, oh, that, you know, they're not coming, who's going to drive them? But when it's cheaper to drive, I don't know. I mean, you you know, you talk about the cost for the panel and all that, but that's not the cost. The cost, like he just mentioned, is tearing up the concrete and running the lines and the added capability. And if it's, you know, on the new construction side, you know, the developers are talking to Encore way ahead of, you know, most of the time, if they're smart, before they're even buying the parcels of land and stuff. So, I mean, I think ICC coming out with that guidance and all of that code language right there, just right on time. And I mean, every city would want to modify some of this stuff. And you know, the great thing about it, you could be as aggressive or not as you want. And, you know, that the conversations with the utility companies, as you're modifying that would be smart. Anyway, I don't know where I was even going with that.
I love all feedback. So I'm just popping us back to this this process options. And so I would be curious, because of that safety concern and the IECC amendment language that's coming out, is there anyone that has any sort of idea or concern or barrier in regards to us pursuing? We're basically trying to figure out what you guys need in order to create the best laid out resource. And so if everyone's saying, no, we think the IECC language is great, we're not going to do land use zoning or green building, how do people feel about those different processes and what we can do to further help the possible transition for your local jurisdiction to adopt this? Or if one of them is like, no, we're never going to add this into one of these, definitely don't look forward to that. Yeah, Alex?
Yeah, I've talked with our chief building officer, and I think the ICC language is going to be the way to go. That's kind of the language that they speak. So if they already have this, you know, all the wording, I think that's going to be the easiest way for us to move forward in Farmers Branch.
Okay. Does anyone else have any thoughts? And so from the additional perspective from that IECC language, it's that blank amount. What do you guys consider the best path forward with allowing people to have an educated assessment of a regional consistency of what they can adopt? Is something like the approach of California, where they have a minimum and then they have reach codes? Is that something that sounds good, or is it something that we should be like, do you know what, we believe that this singular number is best for our region, or allow the jurisdiction themselves just to kind of go about and do it themselves in general? Is coming up with possible examples worth it for our region, or how do you think we should go about determining those levels?
Who would it be us as a body that would just, I've sat in conversations with the city of San Antonio, trying to come to consensus on a number just for a city was almost impossible. And trying to come up with a singular number for 40 cities or however many cities it is in several counties in a fairly significant region. I kind of like that, what you've done so far, coupled with the ICC guidance. I mean, you kind of show people some options, what other cities are doing. But I have to toe the company line with Spear, and would certainly recommend we at least do something substantial, something that, hey, you've got to at least, okay, I don't know. There's not, I don't think there's a right answer. That's a tough one.
Yeah, if I could double down on what you were saying a little bit, Jason, and hit you with another question. In your conversations that you've had with, it doesn't have to just be San Antonio, what are the different elements that keep on being brought up in determining those numbers? Like, what are the problems when you were like, it's very difficult to even find one city's number? What are the topics that have been brought up in determining that number in those conversations with those specific cities?
Well, of course, from the multifamily development association, it's costs, and people aren't going to be able to afford these apartments, and there's just going to be a bunch of plugs out there not being used. And Sierra Club, sitting on the other side of me, is like, no, what's going to drive costs is if we don't do this on the front end, and then you have to come back and do it for your tenants, and then back to the apartment association. No, because there will be new developments coming up, and if tenants want that, the market will drive the demand, and those new developments will have it on the development side, and these will be cheaper because we didn't have to do it on the front end. And it's kind of a circular argument depending on who's leading it, or not, because the dichotomy of the two sides having the argument. It's tough to have a resolution. I am real hopeful though, and I understand y'all with COG want to get out on the front of this and promote it, and certainly me with Spear want to promote it and get out on the front end of it. But I mean, that new Ford Lightning truck gonna be a game changer. I mean, they're coming, and they're coming so fast, and they're just right around the corner. A sensible apartment developer would be nuts if he's not running 20% of his parking spots EV, even if the ordinance says 3%. I mean, in my mind, if I'm planning on developing an apartment building and holding it for 10 years, you would be crazy not to do 20% of your spots, because they're coming. They're here, whether you believe in it or not. I mean, you look at all the reports from all the major car manufacturers. I mean, every day I see a different headline on yahoo.com about new models coming, 2021, 2022. I mean, we're going. So, I don't really know. Once again, I'm trying to find.
No, it's good. It's good feedback for sure. And I think that's what the hard thing is right now, is because there is no perfect answer, and both sides are going to fight for the opposite extreme. And so it's trying to find that middle ground. But as we don't have the ability at the Council of Governments to adopt and create, we're not the state. We don't have any jurisdictional capabilities. And so we are just trying to gauge, what do other people need? What can we develop to make this process easier for you? And so with what you were saying and what a couple other people have brought up, it seems that there's going to be the biggest kind of, not backlash, but the biggest issues being brought up with the people building themselves. It's going to be the builders. It's going to be all that. And so would it be helpful, do you think, for us, in addition to this model language, to try to develop resources in kind of mitigating those people's arguments? Like, here's this point you're going to bring up. Well, here's the actual facts for it. Here's this point. Here's the facts, in order to try to help all the governments who are adopting this try to kind of hush the various concerns that are being brought up. And so Lori and Jose both have their hands up, so you guys can each just chime in whenever.
I'm going to take us a different direction. So Jose.
Oh, I'll just chime in from the builder's standpoint, from a consultant, and get a lot of that. And I think if we can demonstrate the value of the demand that's coming, I mean, like somebody had said it, I mean, the information is out there. If we can slowly chip away at well, I don't know, it's going to be too expensive up front, and then that'll eventually ease with time. Because for a multifamily tenant or a commercial development, if more and more people are asking for EVs, which I'm willing to bet in the next 5 years that's really going to happen, that a lot of that will take care of itself. But there's some education that we could do as a group to help mitigate that in the front end.
And ultimately, builders and developers, especially in Texas, are notoriously reactive rather than proactive. And so I think a few of them are, again, so want to get this out there, so want to get cities to adopt it, would love to see it be mandatory. But I think there's going to be some hard lessons learned and some kind of chasing their tails with this stuff, wishing they would have listened to the COG. There's going to be plenty of cities and plenty of building owners thinking, oh, why did I fight that? Why didn't I listen to them?
So I have a question, a comment, and then another comment. One thing that we could I wonder if the prevalence of EV charging at multifamily properties is actually much higher than any of us think. And we would really love to get information on that. As many of you know, we use the Alternative Fuels Data Center, which is Department of Energy funded. Well, it's maintained by one of the national labs, so consequently funded in part by the Department of Energy. And they have, what's really one of the best inventories of EV charging stations nationwide, but what they don't have much of is what is privately accessible. That does not show up in the feed that they get from the big EV charging station network companies, like the ChargePoints, the EVgo's. They basically have a live feed up to the Alternative Fuels Data Center that updates every 24 hours with all of their network stations, but they don't feed the privately accessible stations that are like behind a workplace gate or behind a multifamily gate. And when we did our National Drive Electric Week event here a couple weeks ago, I took flyers about the event to the 2 apartment complexes that were kind of adjacent to the event site. And I said, hey, do you happen to have EV charging already for your residents? And both of them did. And both of them said that, yeah, we don't get a lot of feedback. People ask if we have it. We say yes. We never really hear much more, so we think it works well. So people are asking about it. And these particular developments, 2 out of 2, had it. So if there's anybody that has insight on how we could get information on how many multifamily properties may have EV charging and just get a better handle on where the market is right now, that would be really helpful. So I'll just throw that out there as an ask. We're happy to take thoughts now or afterwards. And then I wanted to just call attention to Greg Royster's comment, because Bailey, I think if you're screen sharing, you may not be able to see it. But he asked if we have thought about mobile fast charging, and that DFW Airport is considering mobile fast charging as a possible. Let me see if I'm interpreting this correctly, Greg. It may be a strategy where y'all would be able to serve a larger volume of vehicles and use off-peak charging as opposed to doing permanent, kind of traditional installed stations, which is a very interesting approach. And so I wanted to make sure I was interpreting that correctly and see if anybody at DFW wanted to elaborate on that.
Sure. So yeah, Lori, that's correct. View it as a strategy. We've got just the sheer numbers, 20,000 plus passenger parking in our terminal garages, and then another 20,000 surface parking for employees primarily. So, you know, I guess the challenge is, you know, would we, you know, what's the right strategy, right? You know, considering being real aggressive with point chargers, we think that's probably not the smartest way to go. So, you know, the strategy is, you know, we talked about inductive charging as well, but another kind of tool we're considering is the mobile fast charging.
Yeah, that's Laura, you can pop in. I'm sorry.
Are you calling on me? Great. I
Yeah.
just wanted to go back to what Lori was saying in terms of trying to get a handle on multifamily charging availability. I know that Austin Energy offers incentives to multifamily, and I wonder they could at least give us some numbers, possibly how many incentives, and have some information about that, and maybe some other utilities or organizations do the same around the state.
Yeah, that's definitely a good for an incentive perspective for places that have multifamily incentives. But reaching out of that's definitely something that we're going to have to figure out, possibly an avenue. But yeah, I think there are places that might have more information that we're aware of. And so trying to not reinvent the wheel would be great. But going back to kind of that mobile fast charging, that also brings in the element of kind of future-proofing EV codes. A lot of this is geared towards just conventional level 2 charging and does not incorporate anything in regards to like resiliency, doesn't incorporate anything vehicle to grid, battery, solar integration, anything like that. And so an additional element that we possibly as a region could be kind of pushing forward as a unique kind of trailblazer would be possibly accommodating additional language to try to add those additional resiliency elements, especially if the grid in Texas is going to be one of probably the biggest barriers from the general public and developer side from pursuing electric vehicles. And so would people have any sort of concerns in addition to adding in those kind of like future elements that we're anticipating to become a lot more relevant, or those kind of resiliency tools that we are kind of pushing for electric vehicles to be a pursuer of? This was just me thinking of this idea right now. So if people are like, no, that's too far right now, we're just trying to get EV readiness in general, and those elements are way too advanced. Hearing no. Okay, great. Thank you, Mindy. I was going to say hearing no objections, we're going to possibly look forward into doing that.
So we only have a few minutes left, Bailey. So if I could jump in with just kind of maybe a question for people to noodle on in advance of the next meeting. You know, the ICC has put this language out, which makes, as Bailey said, makes things a lot easier on us, right? Like we just say, look, the ICC has language. So I think one of the things that we would like to understand from y'all's perspective is what does COG do with this? Is it simply us as staff, we want to raise awareness of this ICC guidance to our local governments and just say this is something that's really interesting. If you want to support electric vehicle adoption, you probably want to take a look at it and just let cities go on their way. Do we take that a step higher and say, here's the ICC thing, here's their blank table, let's fill in for the region, you know, some suggestions on if you want to be kind of bare minimum, here's some percentages. If you want to be really EV, if you want to really embrace EVs and really facilitate them, here's maybe some stronger percentages as kind of an option for cities to consider. Do we go a step further than that and take something to the Regional Transportation Council, which is the policy board for our transportation department, which does take policy positions, and get a resolution that says the Regional Transportation Council recommends that cities across the region adopt this ICC with these thresholds. And then an option associated with that is we can tie transportation development credit funding to adoption of those policies. So those are some kind of levels of activity that we could take on as a regional agency. So appreciate Mindy's thoughts there. And so maybe everybody just kind of think about that. We can maybe in follow up to this, we did something on solar a few years ago where we put together an ordinance document that was like, we're not going to make a value judgment. We're just going to say, if you want to really support solar, here's language you would use. If you want to be somewhat restrictive on solar, here's language you would use. And we just kind of put it out there. I don't know how much local governments use it, but that is a COG product. And we can send that out as kind of an example of kind of the part two. And I see, thank you, Far. I like the idea of a resolution. And we can maybe pull a couple examples of Regional Transportation Council resolutions and policies that have been done on other things, just to kind of give y'all a couple examples of different things that we have done in other areas, and then let y'all guide us on what you think seems appropriate for EV.
Is there a COG group of city officials who meet and discuss the ICC?
Oh, yes.
I know there used to be with the NEC, so.
Yes, there is.
Would that be a group to take it to?
That we suggested that, and this was before the ICC language was out there, but because it wasn't actually, so that group meets to discuss the different code revisions, and because the language wasn't part of the actual code at the national level, it wasn't necessarily within the scope of what they typically discuss. Now we could ask if they would be willing to bring this back in between official code revision cycles. We're cautious about how much we try to tap their time.
Yeah, and I sit on that board, and it's close to being the makeup of the board is close to willing to accept this appendices, solar ready, some of this stuff, but I don't think we would have a majority quite yet. There's still some very cost builder centric or builder or I'm at the loss for the right word right now. I think we feel like as a board, and not really me so much, but just the rest of the board, traditionally, we're just looking at the straight energy code. We're not looking at anything extra in the appendix. We're not looking at promoting green or doing any sort of promotion. And so it's a little bit of a coming from a different place than this is. I mean, this is clearly promoting green and promoting EV ready and let's clean up our air. And although the energy code does do that, we as an energy code board, that's not our charge. Our charge is to modify it for the north central area to make it so building officials can enforce it and builders can build to it. And so there's just a slight disconnect from, and not really from my side, of course, coming from Spear, I'm happy to get it in, but just, I know everybody on that board. I've been on that board for 6 years. Now, granted, we've rotated a lot of people, but there's a lot of the same folks. And I think we would have a hard time passing this with a majority to get it. I don't think we'd have a hard time recommending is a tricky word too. I think it would be better served coming to cities not from the Energy Code Board. I think it would be better served coming to cities on a different avenue from NCTCOG. If we can get it to cities from a different avenue, I think it would be better.
Okay, Catherine, I see you have your hand up.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I was on that committee meeting earlier in the week about the IECC and I think it was a letter of support kind of that got adopted or recommended to go forward for solar ready. So this would be a nice piece to kind of accompany that, but not the same path. Have it all going to our code officials at the same time, while they're looking at all of this, but I understand, some of the feelings that, solar ready and EV ready isn't part of energy efficiency in their minds. So I understand that there wants some separation there, but I still think that the path forward to getting in the code officials' hands needs to be similar. And I'm so happy to see, that the language here from the code officials. So. I like the combination, like Mindy suggested, the combination of 2 and 3, the resolution, something on the transportation.
Okay. Looks perfect. Okay, so it sounds like we have quite a bit of homework and work to do on our perspective. And so it's after 4. And so we do appreciate you all for getting on. In preparation for the next call, it'll probably be at this point, maybe the beginning of the new year. And so just keep it out. We'll probably aim to meet once a quarter with this group, depending on how much back and forth we have. It might be more frequent, might be a little less frequent, depending on our follow-ups and everything like that. But we will go forward and we took notes on this. We'll send some key takeaways, and then if you guys have any concerns or additional topics you want us to look into as we're doing this research and developing this momentum forward, definitely feel free to reach out to us, as well as connecting us with different stakeholders that you've talked to that might have concerns about this. We are trying to do whatever we can to make it easiest for y'all, and so we can't read minds on what we think the barriers will be and things like that. So definitely feel free to be very candid with us, because we want to hear all the opinions. And so like I mentioned before, I did record this, and so we'll go ahead and process it and then get it up on our website within the next couple of days, and I'll email you all with that link, and so you can have that. But in the meantime, yeah, we appreciate you coming on the call this afternoon, and we will be in touch soon. Thank you all.